Well, we wish everybody once again a happy 4th of July, happy Independence Day, even though that was a few days ago, but our nation is still celebrating. People are still celebrating. There's still fireworks in the neighborhood every once in a while. I guess as kids find that they had some more stashed away somewhere. So this idea of freedom, this idea of liberty, right? Remember in the founding documents of our country, it says that people are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, and amongst those, not all defining, but amongst those, are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We're going to talk more about the American Revolution and the expression of freedom in a minute. But the point is that this innate idea of freedom, this innate idea, and what I mean by that, something within us, like a principle within us that is pushing forward, that is coming out. This seems to be something that exists in all people, and in all people of all places of all times. Something that inherently we desire. We desire this freedom. And what we want to talk about today is freedom under the law. Dr. Holmes says that we have liberty, but not license. And what does that mean? Liberty without license. What does freedom under the law mean? So that's where we're gonna go today. Is that each of us is in the process of not only awakening to, but in actually participating in the freedom, the demonstration of freedom in our lives. And if we're going to do that, we have to understand what that is and how that works. Right? So let's look at things first from a biological perspective. Let's look at things from the evolution of biology, as Thomas Troward might explain it to us, as Frederick Bales might explain it to us. Now, Bales, you've heard me mention Bales. Bales was studying to be a doctor, a medical doctor. He was going to be a medical missionary. He was from New Zealand, and he went to London to finish up his training before he was going to go out into the wild somewhere, into the backwoods somewhere, the bush country, and be a medical missionary. And he was diagnosed with the then incurable disease of diabetes at the time. And through the practice of spiritual mind treatment, through affirmative prayer, whatever you want to call it, but through deliberately working with these ideas, his body healed. And he then went on to become a religious science minister. But Bales, if you're of the scientific mind, if you like following things logically, Bales is a good resource because that's the way he explains things. Troward was a judge, a civil judge, and he explained things logically. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Everything he wrote was in the form of a legal argument. Kind of if then, if this then that kind of things. But each of them in their own way kind of looked at the unfoldment, the biological unfoldment of how life itself, this general thing called life, if we look at it and if we look at over the eons, how it has been progressing. It seems to have started with tiny single-celled animals. Just one little dot of life, in the ocean. And they couldn't move about very much. They couldn't swim. They kind of drifted with the tide, And they did not express a large degree of intelligence. Now they could do the very things that they needed to do to survive. They could take in food. They could eliminate waste. They could function biologically and physically, but as far as thinking and reasoning and building bridges and doing the things that human beings can do, of course they didn't do that. But then something happened, something happened. And the cells began to link together to form multi-celled animals. And as they began to join up, then what happened is they started to specialize. So when they were each one individual cell, they had to do everything necessary to survive. Each cell had to do everything necessary to survive. But as the cells joined together and formed multi-celled organisms, the cells began to specialize. And some cells specialized in taking in food, some cells specialized in eliminating waste, some cells specialized in absorbing oxygen, and giving off carbon dioxide. And you can start to see how each of the different functions and each of the different systems of the bodies, not even a human body we're talking about here, but just bodies of life, that life started to specialize itself and provide mobility, right? Flippers and little things that would enable this life to move. Even we can see it in plant life, that there's something in the plant life that knows how to move. If you go outside and you take the leaves on your grapevine, for example, and you turn them over so the gray side is up, the silver side is up. If you go out again in a little while, they'll be turned back the other way. There's an intelligence there that knows which side of the leaf needs to be facing the sun. And there's a locomotion built into the vine just through a twisting and a turning. If you've ever seen a vine kind of climb up a trellis, or mine keeps climbing up my fence and I have to go out and chop it down every once in a while. There's an intelligence within that little tentacle that knows how to wrap it around something so it can gain a hold and it can climb. And the only place that we're going there, the only thing that we're trying to get to there is that with every stage of development, with every step forward, from the single-celled creature maybe to a multi-celled little worm, for example, up to a fish, and then kind of up to something that crawled out of the ocean, and the flippers kind of evolved into legs, and however the scientists want to theorize it, explain it. With every step of unfoldment, there were two things that happened. There was a greater degree of mobility and a greater degree of intelligence. So if we step back far enough, we can say that there's something that is compelling life to evolve towards a higher form of intelligence with a greater degree of locomotion. Now, of course, the materialistic view, the reductionist view of that is, well, that just happened. This just happened. Just through chemistry and through biology, it just kind of happened that we evolved that way. And then the spiritual view is no, there was a consciousness behind that was compelling that forward, that was directing that forward. So if you want to take it back, for example, to the book of Genesis, to the creation myth that we have coming to us in the Hebrew Bible, it says, God said, "Let there be," and there was. God said, "Let there be," and there was. And what you would see, or what we would see then, looking at it from a spiritual point of view, is we would see that the unfoldment, that the involution was the word, "Let there be," but the evolution is the unfoldment of the word. And with each step, we are moving towards a greater degree of freedom and a greater degree of intelligence. So all we have, whether you want to consider it's just purely materialistic, or whether you want to consider that it's purely spiritual, either way, I think you're going to get to a point of acknowledgement that life itself, there's something within life itself that is moving towards greater intelligence, and in that regard, intelligence is the ability to choose, to weigh options, to observe, to decide, and freedom of mobility, freedom to move, freedom to go different places. Dr. Holmes looks at it and he says, if you think about the human experience, we started out and we were pretty much confined to where we could walk. And then we learned how to press animals into service, to either ride them or have them pull carts, And then we learned how to build vessels and canoes and kayaks and things like that, and then bigger ones that would cross the ocean. And then we learned how to build machines to propel those vessels, right? We moved from wind to steam. And at every step of the evolution, if you want to consider it an evolution or an unfoldment of transportation, what was happening? Faster and further, faster and further, faster and further. And then we built cars and airplanes and spaceships. And now we're talking about going to Mars. So there seems to be that something within the human spirit, not just in the biology, but in the human spirit itself, that is pushing it to a greater degree of freedom, to a greater degree of intelligence. I remember when we first started to really get into the unfoldment of the information age, of the internet and computers and networking and all these kinds of things. We used to have a chart on the wall at work, and it showed the history of human beings in a timeline, and it showed, when the first forms of communication came about, so from the time that we had hieroglyphics until the time that we had a mechanical printing press, and then until the time that we had electronic communications. And the time is just getting shorter and shorter and shorter, the advancements in communication. And then we look at the amount of information that we had. Of course, people didn't have a way to print and preserve information. Years and years ago, everything was done by hand, by copyists, with pen and paper, or pen and parchment. And in order to reproduce a book such as the Bible, it took years. It took many different people, and it took years. So this advancement forward is more information, more knowledge, more intelligence, if you want to think of it that way, but perhaps more information to make better decisions, moving towards more freedom. So Emmett Fox then takes it a different step. He looks at it from the evolution of society, from the evolution of the governments that human beings have created. We have to remember then that the governments that we have are creations of the human mind. Even if it was that there was a chief in our tribe, and that chief made all of the decisions. That was a human agreement, maybe not a conscious agreement. Maybe people were born into that society. Around here in the part of the country in which I live, there are many Indian mounds around, and the archaeologists study them. And I attended a lecture by a professor over at the Native American Studies Center in Lancaster, South Carolina. And he said the Indian mounds themselves, they were like City Hall. The chief built his or her hut up on the top of the mound, and the entire village was kind of cast around them. And people would come to that mound all during the day to get whatever decisions they needed made by the chief to be made. There was an agreement that this person was in charge. They built their house up high so everybody could see them, and everybody else kind of followed along, followed their orders, followed their decrees, whatever it might be. But that's an agreement, you know. So if we look at the different systems of government that we had, the different organizations, we kind of went from tribal existence, where perhaps the chief might be the strongest person in the tribe, the one who could protect the tribe, the greatest warrior and all those things, and then that kind of evolved, and we went into a feudal system, and you had monarchies, and then you had kind of an elite class, and then you had a peasant class, And the idea years ago was that the peasantry lived at the pleasure of the king and worked for the king, and the king owned the land, and all of these kind of things. But what Emmett Fox tells us is that started to change, you see. That didn't fit well with this innate desire within people to express freedom. And slowly over time, if we look at our own history here in the United States, of course, a lot of it comes from England because the laws that founded this nation generally came from England. But there were advances in the thinking, where instead of people living at the will or the pleasure of the king, then the idea that got introduced that the king ruled at the pleasure of the people. The king represented the people. See? I think there was Magna Carta. So we had this evolution of ideas that, no, one person cannot tell us what to do. One person cannot make all the decisions for us. One person cannot be completely in charge. We as human beings, we as spiritual beings, we are free, or should be free, to make those decisions for our own self. And then, of course, we come to the American Revolution. Now, if you can find it, Emmett Fox wrote a little booklet, a little pamphlet. A lot of his work was just, 10 or 15 pages long. I remember when we first started our bookstore, they sold for like $1 a piece. We used to be able to get them from DeVores and Company. And one of them he wrote, I believe, is called The Historical Destiny of the United States. And if you can get a hold of that, it's very interesting. Just a few ideas, many of which I'm giving you today. But he said what happened is as people came to this new continent, it was harder and harder, of course, for the monarchy to keep control over the colonies, as spread out as they were. And the desire for people to be free, to govern themselves, to make decisions for themselves, it was inevitable that they would eventually, human beings would eventually form a government where we declared that to be our truth. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. We are all created life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was inevitable that human beings would come forward and say, no, see, we don't need a king in a faraway land to tell us what to do. We have a right of self-determination. We have a right of self-governance. So the idea of of the founding of the United States was kind of an evolution that was coming for many, many thousands of years. A move towards a greater degree of freedom, a greater degree of self-expression. This idea that we could pursue our own happiness. It was bound to happen. It was bound to come. And if you understand that, if you kind of look at that, then you have to project and say, well, where is that going to go in the future, you see? What is the next step? What is the next step in that evolution of this freedom, the unfoldment of this freedom? Now we're going to talk about the individual in just a second, the unfoldment of freedom as an individual, as you and I. But one thing we have to understand in our country is that even though we are free, even though our country was founded on the principle that each and every one of us is free to pursue happiness. We can't do that in violation of the law. In other words, we are free to pursue our happiness as long as in pursuing happiness we don't take anything away from another. We don't harm another. Right? So I can't say, well, it would make me very, very happy to have your car, so therefore I'm going to go over to your house at midnight and take it. Right? I can't use the Constitution as a defense and say I was pursuing happiness. Well, Your Honor, I thought it would make me happy, so I went and took that car. Can't do that. See, there are consequences. There are consequences. There is freedom under the law, and misusing that freedom can bring about unpleasant consequences. Now, the flip side of that is using that freedom properly, using that freedom constructively. Well, that can bring about pleasant consequences. So even in our country, where the idea of personal liberty and personal freedom is kind of the founding principle of the country, we do not have license, to put it that way, liberty but not license. License, to my understanding, license means you just do whatever you want and there's no repercussions. You know, you see this in kind of the way some of the cruel kings were portrayed. They're king, they could do whatever they want, you know, kind of Alice in Wonderland, off with their heads kind of thing, you know. There's just absolutely no negative consequences under this idea of license. Just do what you want. But we have liberty but not license, is what Dr. Holmes tells us. We are free, but we are free under the law. So now let's come to this idea of personal freedom, and then let's see where we are and how it comes together. So as individuals, as we are growing up, as our consciousness is maturing, and this is both you and I kind of going from the stages of infant to toddler to you know, preschooler to the school child and so on, but it's also kind of the evolution of the consciousness of the human race as a whole. We begin our experience and we are not very free. We don't have very much freedom. We are completely at the mercy of other people. We can't feed ourselves. We can't move. Can't roll over. Remember when your baby, the first time your baby rolled over, Alex? Oh, the baby rolled over. So pretty much when we're born, people lay us down in whatever position they lay us in, that's where we're going to be until somebody comes and picks us back up again. It's not a whole lot of freedom. There's a great deal of dependency there. But as we start to grow, then we start to develop the ability to move. We develop more freedom, see? And we develop our intelligence, and we have other experiences, and we start to entertain other possibilities, and our imagination creates possibilities for us. Or perhaps we could say our imagination becomes aware of the possibilities. Maybe it doesn't create anything, it just sees them. And then we are free. We are free to go out and start to pursue them. And our first experience then, what we try to do in order to experience what we want to experience, we try to get other people to do it for us. We try to learn how to manipulate other people. And I'm not using manipulation necessarily in a bad way, but we try to get them to do what it is that we want done. You know? So, the example of an infant who's hungry, that infant may learn that when it cries a certain way, that mommy will come and feed it. So now it's starting to exhibit a certain amount of control over its environment, but it's still very, very dependent. See? So a lot of its first experience in life then is how do I work the system in order to get what I want out of it? Because all of the power is out there. All of the resources are out there. They're outside my crib somewhere. They're outside my playpen. How How can I get people to come and do things for me? And I think it was Frederick Bales says that when the child learns to say "Daddy," it learns that it can get whatever it wants. So I always thought that was cute. But then we start to develop further, and we realize, well, wait a second. I've got a certain amount of power myself. I've got a certain ability myself. I don't have to try to figure out how to get other people to do things for me. I can become kind of self-sufficient. I can start to do things for myself. Do we move out of kind of that first stage of development? We start to move into, perhaps we could call it becoming an adult. Not necessarily so, but that's probably the best phrase I have for it now. So now we start to recognize that it's not so much that everything is being done to me, and I've got to figure out how to get people to do the things I want to me and not do the things I don't want to me. But now I've got self-determination. See, kind of where the Constitution started. We have self-determination. So now we can go and we can start to do things for ourselves. We can start to grow. We can start to decide. So when we were children, our parents told us do this or do that. When we went to school, our teachers told us read this chapter, write this essay, do all these kind of things. But now we can start to decide for ourselves what it is that we want to do, and we go through that phase. But then something else happens to us. See, then we start to ask and ponder the bigger questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And we start to recognize our spiritual nature. And we start to recognize that this thing that we call God, this power that we call God, or we call love, or we call spirit, or we call nature, by whatever means, by whatever words we choose to call it, it is completely free. It is completely free. And its mode of creation, its mode of making things happen, is through the process of thought. Right? In the beginning was the Word was made flesh, kind of thing. God said, let there be, excuse me, and there was. And then we start to realize that because that power has created us out of itself, that power is part of us as well. That power responds to us as well. Not because of who we are, but because of what we are. And by that I mean not because I'm a good person, not because I'm a bad person, but because I'm a person, because I am an expression of God. And then we start to become interested in ultimate freedom, which is the freedom to control our thoughts, the freedom to control our mind. What we start to realize then is that life is constantly responding to us according to what we believe. That's the way that this power works. That's the way this law of mind works. And if we choose to bring our thoughts a certain way, then we start to have certain experiences. If we just let our thoughts go willy-nilly and random, we get whatever comes along. For those who are on the Wednesday night group, we started reading Selby's book on the physics of God, and I found a videotape on YouTube of Dean Radin kind of explaining that if they take people who are trained meditators and they ask them to bring their attention to a physical system, that the way that physical system works changes. And they measure that, and then they come up with, statistical probabilities and all these things. But the point he was making, excuse me while I get a drink here. The point he was making is that things that should be totally unrelated to consciousness are not. Or at least from his scientific point of view, appear to be not. From a religious point of view, we would say everything is consciousness, everything is God, everything is mind. But what we're getting to there is that through the process of scientific experimentation, some scientists are starting to say the same thing that religious teachers have been saying for thousands of years. It's done unto you according to your belief. So now we start to come to a point of realization that our ultimate freedom, this desire that is expressing through us, this desire that has been pushing through all of life since the day the first single-celled creature appeared on the face of the earth. This desire to be totally free, it already exists within us. But what we must do, if we wish to be free, is we have to learn how it works, and we have to learn how to cooperate with it. Now, a big point we need to consider right here is freedom under the law. Sometimes when we start to awaken to this idea, change your thinking, change your life, there's a power in the universe that responds to you according to your belief. If you can believe, so it is done to you. We think, well, gee, I could have anything. I could do anything. I could be anything. And we have to remember freedom under the law. If we misuse that power, we bring unpleasant consequences to ourselves. Just like if I went over to the neighbor's house and took their car at midnight. If we misuse the law of mind, we will ultimately experience unpleasant consequences. So this is why Dr. Holmes says, before you go to do anything, ask yourself, does it give a greater expression to life and to love and to truth and to beauty? And if you can answer any one of those yes, then ask yourself, does it try to take anything away from another, or does it try to harm anyone? And if the answer to both of those is no, he says, then go for it. Then go for it, because there's nothing in the universe that stands in your way. So what we come to realize then, what we come to believe is that this nebulous thing called freedom that we all desire, and seems that we have been created to pursue that, right? It's almost like freedom is pursuing us, that ultimately it comes down to us working with our own consciousness. And if you step back and look at what Dr. Holmes is telling us, if you look at what the Zen Buddhists are telling us, if you look at what different philosophies and teachers have been telling us for all time, it is we have to learn how to work with our own consciousness. Buddhism tells us that pain and suffering exists because of our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And we need to stop that. And then we stop the pain and suffering. In our Christian heritage, we might be told that pain and suffering exist because of sin, which I would say is erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And stop sinning, you see. And Dr. Holmes would tell us then that all of our problems come from this misguided belief in separation. And that when we can tear down those ideas of separation, then we shall eliminate the pain and the suffering, and we shall start to experience the freedom. And Joseph Campbell gives us an image from Buddhism, kind of a drawing or a scene or a statue, I can't remember which it was. And it's very reminiscent of the story of the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and the two cherubim were put at the gate to keep them from getting back into finding the tree of life, right? Because they ate from the tree of the knowledge, not the reality, but the knowledge of good and of evil. And of course, the need to put the cherubim there tells us that our desire is to get back in that garden and eat from the other tree. We want to eliminate this false belief in duality. We want to get back to the singularity, back to the unity, back to the oneness of life. This oneness that is pushing all of life into a greater expression of freedom, a greater experience of freedom. And Campbell gives us the image in Buddhism. There's a scene of the Buddha is sitting in a cave, at the mouth of the cave, looking out in meditation, with one hand held up with a palm out, like a crossing guard might hold their palm out to stop traffic. And on either side of the mouth of the cave are these two ugly creatures with swords and all things like that. Same image, same imagery as the Garden of Eden, the cherubim outside the Garden of Eden. And what Campbell tells us is what that imagery is that if we wish to get back to that, into that experience of the peace, into that experience of the calm, into that experience of the oneness, into that experience of the complete freedom, we have to get past those two guards. And those two guards are nothing more than our own consciousness, our fears and our desires. And the hand being held with the palm up is, pay no attention to them. They are not real. We have to learn how to work with our own consciousness to move beyond the delusions of our own minds, of our own beliefs, of our own thoughts. We need to move beyond all of the ideas that would separate us, that would divide us. And we need to move back into that mystical unity of oneness. In Christianity, it might be expressed as, I and the Father are one, and you and I are one. There is oneness. There is singularity. There is onlyness. There is isness. Now, switching back to forms of government for just a moment, and then coming back to how it unfolds in our individual life. Many of us, as we were growing up in history or in civics or in some such class, we were taught of the tragedy of the commons. And the idea was that when people first came to I think it was Boston, they decided that this one area would be a common area for grazing, and everybody could take their animals out there and let them graze. And everybody owned it. Everybody owned the commons. And the lesson that we were given in history, and of course they were trying in some regards to put down ideas of socialism, of communism, of communities owning things, The idea was that because everybody owned it, nobody took care of it. Nobody took care of it. And of course, the lesson that I got in school out of that, what we were being told was, this idea of individual ownership and people caring for their own things was better than this idea of a group of people trying to own things. And of course, that was just one example. You could go look at the Shakers, for example, and the Shaker communities, and they're wonderful, wonderful examples of communal ownership. So that people who wrote the textbook selected that for a reason. But the idea is that it needed to be cared for. It needed to be taken care of. But through absentee landlords, no one was taking care of it. And because no one was taking care of it, it fell into a state of disrepair. You might argue a similar thing is happening if you look at our electoral process here in this country. A small number of people who actually go out and vote. I think we talked with the public relations officer for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Elections. We were doing some research for a TV show. And she said that the current mayor of Charlotte won the primary race by less than 1% of the people who actually voted, and the people who actually voted were, 10 or 15% of those who were registered. So it's such a small amount of people who actually go out and do the things that they need to do in order to participate. You might say then what has happened to our forms of government now is that they too have fallen into a state of disrepair because people aren't paying attention. They aren't doing the things that they want to do. And then we have to move that to the individual. We have to move that to the individual state. And this is the one that you and I can do something about. See, we could look out there and say, why doesn't everybody else change? Why doesn't everybody change at once? But we have to look at the individual. This is my Jim's theory of evaporation versus boiling. And I'll share it with you one more time. If you take a pot of water and you put it on the stove and you turn up the heat under it, that eventually all of the water in that pot gets very near the boiling point. And then you start to see the bubbles coming up from the bottom of the pot, and you start to see the water becoming steam, and it leaves. So we have raised everything together. We have raised all of the water molecules together at the same time to the point where they have this escape, they have this breakthrough, they move into a greater expression of freedom. But if you take water out in your yard and you create a puddle, if you have a puddle in your yard, the puddle evaporates. Now, every molecule in that puddle does not reach the boiling point at the same time. If you put a thermometer in the puddle would be whatever the outside temperature happens to be, maybe a little bit warmer if it's sitting in the direct sunlight and it's, sitting on asphalt that's black or something like that. But the entire puddle of water does not reach the boiling point at the same time. But what happens is individual molecules of water do. The scientists will tell us they reach escape velocity and they evaporate. So over time the puddle disappears, but not in unison, not with a great bubbling over and a boiling and things like that. So in the evolution of human consciousness, as we move forward to what seems to be our destiny, the historical destiny of our soul, is to move into a greater degree of freedom, is we have to do it one at a time. We can't wait for everybody to get it all at the same time. We have to take care of that part of consciousness, which is us, that part that we can do something with. So then the question becomes, well, if I recognize then that the destiny of my soul is one of a greater degree of expressing freedom, a greater degree of intelligence, a greater degree of choice, really a greater degree of love. And if the ultimate tool that I have to work with is my own consciousness, removing and letting go of ideas of separation, believing in ideas of unification, choosing wisely that which I would experience in my life, and like the dedicated meditators who are able to somehow exert an influence over the circumstances around them, can I bring myself to a point of believing thoroughly enough and long enough, keeping our mind on the things we want, to have the law of mind produce in my life those things that I wish to have? Then it seems that the part that we must play, what we must do in order to avoid the tragedy of the commons, and where I was going with that is, if nobody is taking care of consciousness, then we get what we're getting now. Right? We kind of get a mishmash of things, and the pendulum swings one way and the pendulum swings the other way. So what is required is that you and I take dominion over our own consciousness and learn to exist as the spiritual beings that we are. And we do that through our spiritual practice, through a dedication and through a commitment to our spiritual practice. We have to find that practice that works for us, and we have to work with it. We have tools in our metaphysical toolbox. We have affirmations, we have meditation, we have visualization, we have spiritual mind treatment. We have many different things, many different ways that are all trying to do the same thing, which is to bring us to a point of realization that the only thing that there really is God. And we are part of that. And that is our ultimate freedom. That is our ultimate destiny. So we come to a point of recognizing that freedom is, freedom is. But if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, we see that those who signed it pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors. They were ready to do something about that. There's a quote. I have no idea if it's actually true or not, but there's a quote by John Adams who said, if we fail, I pray that they grease the rope before they hang us. They knew that what they were doing had consequences. They knew that what they were doing, if they failed, could cost them their mortal lives. But nevertheless, they did the things that they felt they needed to do in that time and in that place in order to express, in order to move into this greater degree of expressing freedom. And we have to come back to our own selves, and we don't have to take up arms against anyone. That's not where the battle is. What we must do is learn to spend time with ourselves and keep our mind on the things we want and keep our minds off the things we want. And do our spiritual practice to, as Dr. Holmes said, insulate, isolate, and inoculate ourselves from the race consciousness so that we're not caught up in the tragedy of the commons, of human consciousness that we see unfolding before us every day in the news. That's undisciplined mind at work. That's what that is. And as long as we know that, we don't have to get caught up in it. What we have to get caught up in is taking the time to be with our own self, with our own consciousness, to do the practices that we have been taught over thousands of years, to learn how to keep our mind stayed on the things that are true and are right and are good, to see things as they truly are. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, there's just one simple line that says, "Be still and know. Be still and know." Are we willing to take the time to practice being still? Are we willing to take the time to create that space in our consciousness so the very life force that is moving us into a greater expression of freedom can do its work? See, evolution might have taken millions and millions of years, but our spiritual growth, which is the evolution of our consciousness into a greater experience of oneness, well, that amount of time that takes depends on how much time we put into our practice. So this year, this 4th of July, this time of the year where we celebrate our independence, where we declare our desire for freedom, I invite you to consider that everything that you need for the full and complete expression of your personal freedom is already here. You already know. You've already been told. I have been told. We have all been told. It's in the sacred scriptures of every tradition. Be still and know. Be still and know. Pledge your life, your fortune, your sacred honor to your spiritual growth. Take your time to do your practice. Take your time to read and study the things that inspire you to feel closer to God. Take the time to cooperate with the compulsion of life to be free. Thomas Troward tells us that we have entered the fifth kingdom. He says life has evolved up from the mineral, through the plant, through the animal, through the human, and now we have stepped into the fifth kingdom, the spiritual kingdom. Life, biology, chemistry has taken us as far as it can go. The rest is up to us to do with consciousness. Let's do what we can. And so it is.